Harold Thompson wiped the sweat from his forehead as he finished milking the last cow. At 78 years old, his hands were not as steady as they used to be, but he still loved working on the farm. His wife, Margaret, was in the kitchen making breakfast. The smell of bacon and eggs filled the air. They had been married for 55 years and had built this dairy farm together from nothing. The farm sat on 200 acres of good Kansas land. Harold and Margaret had bought it when they were young and full of dreams. They worked hard every day to make it successful. Harold took care of the cows and the fields. Margaret handled the chickens and the vegetable garden. Together they raised 3 children on this farm. Michael was the oldest, then Sarah and David was the youngest. Harold walked slowly to the house. His chest felt tight, and he was breathing hard. Margaret looked at him with worry in her eyes. She had noticed that Harold was getting tired more easily these days. He sat down at the kitchen table and put his hand on his chest. "Are you feeling okay, Harold?" Margaret asked. She set down his plate of eggs and bacon. Her gray hair was tied, back in a neat bun, just like she had worn it for 30 years. "I'm fine, just a little tired," Harold said. But he was not fine. The pain in his chest was getting worse. He tried to eat his breakfast, but he could not finish it. Later that morning, Harold was feeding the cows when the pain hit him like a hammer. He fell to his knees in the barn. Margaret found him there 20 minutes later. She called for help right away. The doctor at the hospital said Harold had suffered a heart attack. It was not too bad, but it was serious enough to change everything. Harold would need to rest for several weeks. He could not do heavy work anymore. The doctor said he needed to take things easy from now on. Michael came to visit them at the hospital. He was 45 years old and owned a construction company in the city. He wore an expensive suit and looked successful. He sat next to his father's bed and spoke in a serious voice. "Dad, you and Mom can't keep running this farm alone." Michael said, "You're both getting older, and now with your heart problems, it's too dangerous." Harold looked at his son. "We've been running this farm for 40 years, Michael. We know what we're doing." "That was before your heart attack, Dad. What if something happens and Mom can't get help in time? What if you have another heart attack, out in the field?" Margaret held Harold's hand. She was scared too. The farm was a lot of work, and Harold's heart attack had frightened her. Maybe Michael was right. Sarah came to visit the next day. She lived 2 hours away with her husband and 2 teenage children. She was 42 years old and worked as a school teacher. She agreed with Michael. "Mom, Dad, we're worried about you," Sarah said. "The farm is too much work for people your age." David, the youngest at 38, arrived that evening. He had always been interested in farming and knew the most about running the dairy operation. He had worked on the farm during summers, when he was young. "I have an idea," David said. "What if I take over the daily operations of the farm? I can handle the business side of things, and you two can still live there and help out when you feel like it." The 3 children talked among themselves while Harold and Margaret listened. The children seemed to have it all figured out. Michael would help with the legal paperwork. Sarah would visit more often to check on their parents. David would move back to the farm and run the daily operations. "You two have worked so hard all your lives," Michael said. "It's time to relax and let us take care of things." Harold was not sure about this plan. He had always been the one to make decisions about the farm. But the children kept talking about safety and how worried they were. They said they loved their parents and wanted to help. "We just need you to sign some papers so David can handle the business accounts and make decisions about the cattle and equipment," Michael explained. "It's just to make things easier." Margaret squeezed Harold's hand. She could see that her husband was tired and confused. The heart attack had scared him more than he wanted to admit. Maybe the children were right. Maybe it was time to let them help. After 3 days in the hospital, Harold signed the papers. The documents gave David power to make decisions about the farm operations. Michael had brought a lawyer friend to make sure everything was legal. The children said this was the best way to keep the farm in the family. When Harold and Margaret returned home from the hospital, David was already there with his clothes and belongings. He had moved into the spare bedroom in the farmhouse. He seemed excited about running the farm. For the first few weeks, everything seemed fine. David got up early to milk the cows. He handled the feed orders and talked to the buyers. Harold tried to help, but David told him to rest and let his heart heal. "Don't worry about anything, Dad," David said. "I've got everything under control." But slowly, things began to change. David started making decisions without asking Harold or Margaret what they thought. He sold some of the older cows and bought new equipment without discussing it first. When Harold asked about these changes, David said he was just trying to make the farm more profitable. Michael visited one weekend and talked about how the farmhouse needed a lot of repairs. He walked around pointing out problems with the roof, the plumbing, and the heating system. "This house is falling apart," Michael said. "Mom and Dad, you can't live here while we're doing major repairs. It would be too dangerous and too noisy." "Where would we live?" Margaret asked. "We've been thinking about that," Sarah said. "There's that old storage room in the barn." David fixed it up a little. "It would just be temporary, maybe 2 or 3 months while we get the house repaired." Harold looked at the storage room. It was small and cold. There was a tiny window and concrete floors. David had put in a small heater and moved a bed and some furniture in there. "This is just until the house is fixed," David promised. "Then you can move back in and everything will be like new." Harold did not want to move to the barn, but the children kept talking about safety and repairs. They said the house might be dangerous to live in during construction. Margaret was worried about Harold's health and thought maybe they should listen to their children. So Harold and Margaret moved their belongings to the small room in the barn. They told themselves it was only temporary. Their children loved them and were trying to help. Soon they would be back in their own house and everything would be better. But as the weeks passed, Harold began to wonder if they had made a terrible mistake. The children's visits became less frequent. The house repairs never seemed to start. And life in the barn was much harder than Harold and Margaret had expected. The farm that had been their home for 40 years was starting to feel like a place where they no longer belonged. Winter came early that year. The small room in the barn where Harold and Margaret lived was cold and damp. The concrete floor made their feet ache, even when they wore thick socks and slippers. The tiny heater David had brought them was not enough to keep the room warm. Margaret wrapped herself in 2 blankets as she sat on the edge of the bed. She could see her breath in the cold air. Harold was trying to fix the window where cold air was coming through. His fingers were stiff from the cold, and he could not get the tape to stick properly. "Maybe we should ask David for another heater," Margaret said. Harold sighed. "I asked him yesterday. He said this heater should be enough and that the house repairs would start soon." But the house repairs never started. When Harold walked past the farmhouse, it looked exactly the same as it had 3 months ago. The roof still had the same loose shingles. The front porch still had the same squeaky boards. Nothing was being fixed. David was living in the warm farmhouse while Harold and Margaret stayed in the cold barn. David said he needed to be in the house to plan the repairs and keep an eye on things. He promised his parents they would move back soon. The children's visits became less and less frequent. Michael used to come every weekend, but now he came maybe once a month. When he did visit, he always seemed to be in a hurry. "How's the construction business, Michael?" Harold asked during one short visit. "Busy, Dad, really busy. I've got 3 big projects going right now. I can't stay long today." Michael looked at his watch. "I need to get back to the city." "When do you think the house repairs will start?" Margaret asked. "Soon, Mom. These things take time. We need to get permits and find the right contractors." But Harold noticed that Michael never seemed to actually do anything about the permits or contractors. He just talked about how busy he was and how complicated the repairs would be. Sarah's visits were even less frequent. She used to come every 2 weeks, but now Harold and Margaret were lucky to see her once a month. When she did come, she always had excuses. "I'm sorry I haven't been here more often," Sarah said during a brief visit in November. "Jenny has volleyball practice, and Tommy needs help with his college applications. You know how busy teenagers keep you." "We understand," Margaret said, but her voice was sad. "We just miss seeing you." "I miss you too, Mom. But with my teaching job and the kids' activities, I barely have time to breathe. You two are doing fine here, right? David is taking good care of you?" Harold wanted to tell Sarah that they were not doing fine. He wanted to tell her that they were cold and lonely, and that David barely spoke to them anymore. But Sarah always seemed to be rushing off to somewhere else. She never stayed long enough for a real conversation. David was the worst of all. Even though he lived right there on the farm, he avoided his parents. He got up early and worked outside, all day. He came home late and went straight to the farmhouse. Sometimes Harold and Margaret did not see him for days at a time. When Harold tried to talk to David about farm business, David became impatient. "Dad, I told you I've got everything handled. You don't need to worry about the farm anymore, just focus on getting better." "But I want to know what's happening with my cows," Harold said. "They're not your cows anymore, Dad, remember? You signed the papers giving me control of the farm operations." Harold felt like he had been punched in the stomach. These were his cows. He had raised some of them from calves. He had built this farm with his own hands. How could David talk to him like he was a stranger? The worst part was the phone calls. Harold and Margaret had an old phone in their barn room, but when they tried to call their children, they rarely answered. When the children did answer, they always seemed busy or distracted. "Can I call you back later, Dad?" Michael would say. "I'm in the middle of something important," but he never called back. Margaret tried calling Sarah one afternoon when she was feeling particularly lonely. "Hi, Mom," Sarah said. "I can't really talk right now. I'm at parent-teacher conferences. Can this wait?" "I just wanted to hear your voice," Margaret said. "That's sweet, Mom, but I really need to go. I'll try to call you this weekend." But the weekend came and went without a call from Sarah. Harold's health was getting worse. The cold, damp conditions in the barn were not good for his heart. He developed a cough that would not go away. His chest hurt and he felt tired all the time. When he asked David to take him to see the doctor, David said he was too busy. "Can't you drive yourself, Dad?" "You know I can't see well enough to drive anymore," Harold said. "And your mother never learned how to drive." "Well, I've got a lot of work to do today. Maybe next week." But next week came and David was still too busy. Margaret was having her own health problems. The cold floor hurt her joints and she had trouble walking some days. She had developed a bad cough from breathing the damp air in the barn. But like Harold, she could not get to a doctor. The food situation was getting worse too. David had promised to bring them groceries every week, but he often forgot. Sometimes Harold and Margaret went 3 or 4 days with very little to eat. When Harold reminded David about the groceries, David acted annoyed. "I brought you food last week," David would say. "That was 10 days ago," Harold would reply. "Well, I've been busy. Make a list and I'll try to get to the store when I have time." Harold and Margaret started to realize that their children were not just busy. Their children were avoiding them on purpose. The promised house repairs were never going to happen. The temporary stay in the barn was becoming permanent. Late at night, Margaret would cry quietly so Harold would not hear her. She could not understand how her children could treat them this way. She and Harold had worked so hard to give their children good lives. They had paid for school clothes and college tuition. They had helped with down payments on houses and cars. They had babysat grandchildren and given birthday money and Christmas presents. Harold lay awake at night listening to the wind blow through the cracks in the barn walls. He thought about all the years he had spent building this farm. He remembered teaching his children how to milk cows and drive tractors. He remembered the pride in their faces when they helped with the harvest. Now those same children acted like Harold and Margaret were burdens to be hidden away. The farm that had been their life's work was being run by someone who treated them like unwanted guests. Winter was getting colder, and Harold and Margaret were getting weaker. They began to wonder if their children were waiting for them to die. Maybe that would solve everyone's problems. Maybe that was the real plan all along. Harold opened the small refrigerator in their barn room and stared at the nearly empty shelves. There was a half loaf of old bread, some cheese that was starting to get moldy, and a few eggs. Margaret was still sleeping, and he did not want to wake her. She had been coughing all night again. It had been 5 days since David had brought them any groceries. Harold had asked him twice, but David always said he would get to it later. Harold looked at the bread and decided to save it for Margaret. She needed to eat more than he did. Harold made himself a cup of tea using the small camping stove David had given them. The stove only had one burner, so they could only cook one thing at a time. Harold sat on the edge of the bed and sipped his tea. It was the only warm thing he would have until evening. Margaret woke up coughing. The sound made Harold's heart hurt. She had been getting sicker, but David would not take her to see a doctor. David said doctors were expensive and that old people coughed all the time. He said it was normal. "Good morning, dear," Harold said. He helped Margaret sit up and gave her a glass of water. "Is there any breakfast?" Margaret asked. Harold gave her the last piece of bread with a little bit of the cheese. He pretended he had already eaten, but his stomach was empty and growling. "I think I'll go look around the barn today," Harold said. "Maybe there are some old things we can sell." Margaret nodded. They both knew they needed money. David had told them he was handling all their finances now, but he never gave them any spending money. They had no cash for food or medicine or anything else they needed. Harold spent the morning searching through old boxes and equipment in the barn. He found some old tools that might be worth something. There was a handsaw that still looked good, and some wrenches that were not too rusty. He also found an old leather saddle that had belonged to his father. Behind some old hay bales, Harold discovered something interesting. There were vegetable seeds from last year's garden. Margaret had always saved seeds to plant the next spring. Harold gathered up the packets of seeds. Maybe they could grow some food. When Margaret felt strong enough, they went outside to look for a place to plant a garden. The ground behind the barn got good sunlight and was protected from the wind. Harold used an old shovel to turn over the soil. It was hard work and his chest hurt, but he kept going. Margaret helped plant the seeds. They planted tomatoes, beans, carrots, and lettuce. It would be months before anything was ready to eat, but it gave them hope. At least they were doing something to help themselves. "Remember when we first started farming?" Margaret said as she covered the carrot seeds with soil. "We were so young and excited about everything." "I remember," Harold said. "You were the prettiest girl in the county, and I could not believe you wanted to marry a farm boy like me." Margaret smiled for the first time in weeks. "You were not just any farm boy, you were my farm boy." They worked in the garden every day when the weather was good. It felt good to have something to do besides sit in the cold barn room. Harold also started fixing old farm equipment that was broken or rusty. He could not use the big tools anymore, but he could still work with his hands. Harold found an old lawnmower that just needed a new spark plug. He fixed it, and then walked to the neighbor's farm to see if anyone needed yard work done. Mrs. Peterson, who lived a mile down the road, hired him to mow her grass for $20. It was not much money, but it was something. Harold walked home with the $20 bill in his pocket, feeling proud. He had not felt useful in months. Margaret started collecting eggs from the chickens that still lived on the farm. David had said the chickens belonged to the farm operation now, but Margaret gathered the eggs anyway. She and Harold needed food more than David needed a few eggs. Margaret also found wild plants growing around the farm that were good to eat. She remembered which ones were safe from when she was a young girl. Her grandmother had taught her about wild onions and dandelion greens and other plants that could be used for food or medicine. The neighbors started to notice that Harold and Margaret were living in the barn. Mrs. Peterson asked Harold why they were not in the farmhouse anymore. "The house needs repairs," Harold said. He did not want to tell her the whole truth. It was embarrassing to admit that their own children had put them in the barn. "That barn must be awfully cold in the winter," Mrs. Peterson said. "We manage," Harold replied, but they were not managing very well. Harold's cough was getting worse and Margaret was losing weight. The small heater in their room was not enough to keep them warm. They wore all their clothes to bed at night and still shivered under the blankets. Harold started gathering wood to burn in an old barrel outside their room. It was dangerous to burn wood inside the barn, but they needed more heat. He was careful to put the fire out before they went to sleep. Margaret learned to heat water on the camping stove so they could have warm baths in a plastic tub. It was not comfortable, but it was better than nothing. She also washed their clothes in the same tub and hung them on a rope to dry. The hardest part was feeling forgotten. Days would go by without seeing any of their children. David lived in the farmhouse only 100 yards away, but he might as well have been on the moon. Michael and Sarah never called or visited anymore. Harold tried calling his children several times, but they never answered the phone. When he left messages, they did not call back. It was like Harold and Margaret had disappeared from the world. 1. Evening. Margaret fainted while she was cooking dinner on the small stove. Harold found her on the floor next to the camping stove. She was unconscious for several minutes. When she woke up, she was confused and weak. Harold helped her to the bed and gave her some water. He wanted to call for help, but he was afraid. What if the hospital people asked questions about why they were living in a barn? What if they found out that Harold and Margaret's own children had abandoned them? "I'm okay," Margaret said, but she was not okay. She was pale and thin. Her hands shook when she tried to drink the water. "You need to see a doctor," Harold said. "We can't afford a doctor. And David won't take us." Harold sat next to his wife and held her hand. They had been married for 55 years. They had raised 3 children and built a successful farm together. They had worked hard and been good parents and good neighbors. Now they were living like homeless people on their own land. Their children had taken their farm and their house and left them to survive on scraps. Harold felt angry and sad and scared all at the same time. That night, Harold made a decision. He could not let Margaret get any sicker. He could not let both of them waste away in this cold barn while their children lived in comfort. Somewhere, there had to be help. Somewhere, there had to be justice. But first, he needed to find out exactly what their children had done with the farm. Harold had signed papers, but he had never seen copies of those papers. He did not really know what legal rights he and Margaret still had. Harold decided to start looking through old documents and papers. Maybe there was something the children had missed. Maybe there was some way to fight back. He had no idea that. The answer to their problems was hidden right there in the barn, under a loose board in the floor. Harold was looking through old boxes in the corner of the barn when he heard Margaret call his name. She was standing near what used to be the tack room, pointing at something on the floor. "Harold, look at this board. It's loose." Harold walked over to where Margaret was standing. There was a wooden floorboard that was not nailed down properly. When Margaret stepped on it, it moved and made a hollow sound. "That's strange," Harold said. He knelt down and tried to lift the board. It came up easily, like someone had loosened it on purpose. Under the board was a metal box about the size of a shoebox. Harold lifted it out and set it on an old wooden crate. The box was heavy and had a small lock on it. "What do you think is in there?" Margaret asked. "I don't know. Let me see if I can open it." Harold tried to remember if he had ever seen this box before. The tack room had been used to store horse equipment when Harold was young, but they had not kept horses for many years. This box could have been hidden under that board for decades. Harold found an old screwdriver and carefully worked at the lock. It was rusty and old, and after a few minutes, it broke open. Harold lifted the lid and looked inside. The box was full of papers. Some were yellow with age and some looked newer. On top was an envelope with Harold's father's name written on it in faded ink. "These belong to your father?" Margaret asked. "It looks like it. He died 20 years ago. I wonder why. He hid these papers." Harold carefully lifted out the papers. The first thing he found was his parents' marriage certificate from 1923. Under that was his father's discharge papers from World War II. There were also some old bank statements and receipts. At the bottom of the box, Harold found something that made him stop and stare. It was a contract with a company called Midwest Mining Corporation. The contract was dated 1952 and was signed by Harold's father, George Thompson. "What is it, Harold?" Margaret asked. Harold read the contract slowly. It was written in legal language that was hard to understand, but the main idea was clear. Harold's father had signed an agreement, giving Midwest Mining Corporation the right to extract natural gas from under the farm property. "This is a mineral rights lease," Harold said. "My father sold the rights to the gas and oil under our land." "I don't understand. What does that mean?" Harold kept reading. According to the contract, Midwest Mining Corporation would pay royalties to the Thompson family for any gas or oil they took from the land. The contract was supposed to last for 50 years, but there was a clause that extended it automatically if the company was still producing gas. It means that if there's gas under our land and if the company is taking it out, they have to pay us money, Harold explained. Margaret sat down on an old hay bale. Did your father ever mention this? Harold tried to remember. His father had died when Harold was 58 years old. That was 20 years ago. Harold tried to think back to conversations they had had about the farm. I think he mentioned something once about signing some papers for a mining company, Harold said. But he said it was no big deal. He said they gave him a few $100s, and that nothing would probably come of it. Harold looked at the contract again. There was an address for Midwest Mining Corporation in Oklahoma City. There was also a clause that said the company had to send reports and payments to the landowner every 3 months. Harold, if this contract is still good, where are the reports? Where are the payments? That was a very good question. Harold and Margaret had lived on this farm for 40 years, and Harold had never received any reports or payments from a mining company. Harold kept looking through the papers in the box. Near the bottom, he found a bank account statement from 1952. It showed that Harold's father had opened a special account just for the mining royalty payments. The account was at First National Bank in town. Maybe the payments stopped coming, Margaret said. Maybe there was never any gas under our land. But Harold was not so sure. He had heard about other farms in Kansas where mining companies were taking gas from deep underground. The technology had gotten much better in recent years. Companies could now get gas from places they could not reach before. Harold found more papers in the box. There were copies of letters between his father and the mining company. The letters were from the 1950s and 1960s. They showed that the company had been making small payments to Harold's father for several years. The last letter in the box was from 1978, 2 years before Harold's father died. It was from Midwest Mining Corporation, and it said they were using new technology to increase gas production from the Thompson property. The letter said the quarterly payments would be getting larger. Harold, this letter is from 1978. Your father died in 1980. What happened to the payments after he died? Harold did not know. When his father died, Harold had inherited the farm. He had gone through his father's papers, but he had never found anything about mining royalties. Maybe his father had forgotten to tell him about the contract, or maybe the payments had been going somewhere else all these years. Harold looked at the contract again. There was a phone number for Midwest Mining Corporation. The number was old and probably did not work anymore, but maybe the company was still in business. Margaret, I need to call this company and find out what happened to these payments. Margaret looked worried. What if the children find out what you're doing? They don't need to know. Not yet. First, I need to find out if there's really money that belongs to us. Harold took the contract and the other papers back to their barn room. He waited until David was out working in the fields. Then he used the old rotary phone to call directory assistance. I need the number for Midwest Mining Corporation in Oklahoma City, Harold told the operator. I show 2 numbers for that company, sir. Which department do you need? Harold's heart started beating faster. The company was still in business. I need to talk to someone about royalty payments, Harold said. That would be the Landowner Services Department. The number is 405-5555-0847. Harold wrote down the number. His hands were shaking as he dialed. A woman answered on the second ring. Midwest Mining Corporation, Landowner Services. This is Janet speaking. Hello, Janet. My name is Harold Thompson. I think your company might owe me some money. Janet asked Harold for his name and address. She asked him for the lease number from his contract. Harold gave her all the information he could find. Mr. Thompson, let me look up your account. Can you hold for just a minute? Harold waited. Margaret sat next to him on the bed, holding his hand. They both stared at the phone, afraid to hope. Janet came back on the line. Her voice sounded different now, more serious. Mr. Thompson, I need to ask you a few questions. Have you been receiving your quarterly royalty statements? No, I haven't received anything. That's very strange, sir. According to our records, we've been sending quarterly payments to your address for the past 5 years. The payments have been deposited into account number 4457 at First National Bank. Harold felt like someone had hit him in the stomach. How much money are we talking about? Sir, your quarterly payment for the last quarter was $47,000. You should have received it 6 weeks ago. Harold almost dropped the phone. $47,000 every 3 months. That was almost $200,000 a year. Ma'am, I need to know something. Who has been cashing these checks? Harold could barely speak after hearing about the $47,000 payments. His voice was shaking when he talked to Janet from the mining company. Ma'am, I need to understand this better. You said someone has been cashing checks for $47,000 every 3 months? Yes, sir. According to our records, the checks have been deposited regularly into account 4457 at First National Bank. The account is listed under the name Thompson Family Trust. Harold had never heard of any Thompson Family Trust. He looked at Margaret, who was listening to every word. Her face was pale with shock. Janet, can you tell me exactly how long these large payments have been going on? Let me check the computer, Mr. Thompson. Harold could hear her typing. It looks like the payments increased significantly starting in January 2020. Before that, the quarterly payments were much smaller, around $3,000. What happened in 2020 that made the payments so much bigger? We started using new extraction technology called hydraulic fracturing. It allows us to get much more natural gas from your property. The new methods have increased production by about 15 times. Harold did some quick math in his head. $47,000 times 4 payments per year was $188,000 annually. If this had been going on for 5 years, that was almost $1 million. Janet, I need copies of all the payment records. I also need to know exactly who has been signing for these checks. I can send you copies of everything, Mr. Thompson. But I have to ask, if you haven't been receiving the payments, who has? That was exactly what Harold wanted to know. He gave Janet his address at the farm and asked her to send all the records as quickly as possible. After hanging up the phone, Harold sat in silence with Margaret for several minutes. They were both trying to understand what this meant. Harold, if that money belongs to us, where has it been going? Harold thought about the papers he had signed when he was in the hospital. David had said the papers were just to help him manage the farm operations. But maybe those papers had given David control of more than just the daily farm work. I think we need to go to the bank, Harold said. Margaret nodded. But how can we get there? David won't drive us and we can't drive ourselves. Harold thought about this problem. Then he remembered Mrs. Peterson, the neighbor who had hired him to mow her lawn. She was a kind woman, and she had seemed concerned about Harold and Margaret living in the barn. I'm going to ask Mrs. Peterson if she can drive us to town. Harold walked to the Peterson farm and knocked on the door. Mrs. Peterson answered wearing a flour-covered apron. She was baking bread, and the smell reminded Harold of how hungry he was. Harold, what a nice surprise. How are you and Margaret doing? We're fine, Mrs. Peterson. I was wondering if I could ask you a favor. Of course, dear. What do you need? Margaret, and I need to go to the bank in town. I was wondering if you might be able to drive us. I know it's a lot to ask. Mrs. Peterson looked concerned. Is everything all right? Are you having money troubles? Harold did not want to explain the whole situation, but he needed Mrs. Peterson's help. We just need to check on some old bank accounts. It's probably nothing, but we want to make sure everything is in order. Well, of course I can drive you. When would you like to go? Would tomorrow morning be possible? Mrs. Peterson agreed to pick them up at 9 o'clock the next morning. Harold walked back to the barn feeling hopeful for the first time in months. That evening, David came to their barn room. This was unusual because David rarely visited them anymore. He seemed nervous and kept looking around the room. How are you two doing? David asked. We're fine, Harold said. He did not mention anything about the mining company or the bank. I was thinking maybe we should start those house repairs soon. Maybe you could move back into the farmhouse in a few weeks. Harold was surprised. David had been saying the house needed repairs for months, but he had never actually started any work. Why was he suddenly interested in moving them back? That would be nice, Margaret said. This barn is getting awfully cold. David nodded and left quickly. Harold wondered why David had really come to see them. It seemed like he was checking on something, but Harold could not figure out what. The next morning, Mrs. Peterson arrived right on time. She helped Harold and Margaret into her car and drove them to First National Bank in town. Harold had been banking at First National for 40 years. He knew most of the employees, including Mrs. Collins, who was the head teller. "Harold. Margaret. How wonderful to see you," Mrs. Collins said when they walked in. "It's been so long since you've been in." "Hello, Mrs. Collins. We need to ask you about some bank accounts." Harold explained that he was trying to find information about a Thompson family trust account. Mrs. Collins looked confused. "Harold, I don't think you have an account under that name. Let me check the computer." Mrs. Collins typed on her keyboard for a few minutes. Then her expression changed. "Oh my. Harold, there is a Thompson family trust account, but it's not under your Social Security number. It's under David Thompson's Social Security number." Harold felt his stomach drop. "Can you tell me about this account?" Mrs. Collins looked uncomfortable. "Well, I probably shouldn't give out account information without proper authorization. But since David is your son, and this seems to be a family matter." She looked around to make sure no one else was listening, then continued in a quiet voice. "Harold, this account has had some very large deposits over the past few years. Every 3 months there's a deposit of about $47,000. The money comes from something called Midwest Mining Corporation." "How much money is in the account now?" Harold asked. Mrs. Collins checked her computer again. "The current balance is $247,000. Margaret gasped. Harold felt dizzy and had to sit down in a chair next to Mrs. Collins's desk. "Mrs. Collins, that money belongs to me and Margaret. Those mining payments are supposed to come to us." Mrs. Collins looked very worried now. "Harold, are you saying that David has been depositing your money into his own account?" "That's exactly what I'm saying. Can you show me copies of the deposit records?" Mrs. Collins printed out several pages of bank statements. They showed regular deposits of $47,000 going back 5 years. There were also withdrawals, large withdrawals. Harold looked at the withdrawal records. David had taken out money for a new truck, $25,000. There was a payment to a construction company for $35,000. There were payments to credit card companies and loan companies. "Mrs. Collins, David has spent almost $400,000 of our money." Mrs. Collins shook her head sadly. "Harold, I think you need to talk to a lawyer. This looks like it might be fraud." Harold and Margaret sat in Mrs. Collins's office for another hour, going through all the bank records. It was clear that David had been stealing their mining royalty payments for 5 years. He had used their money to buy a truck, renovate his own house, and pay off his personal debts. But there was something else Harold discovered that made him even angrier. According to the bank records, Michael and Sarah had also received money from the account. David had written checks to both of his siblings for thousands of dollars. When Mrs. Peterson drove them back to the farm, Harold was quiet. He was thinking about everything he had learned. His own children had stolen over $1 million from him and Margaret. They had taken the money and then put their parents in a cold barn to live like animals. "What are you going to do, Harold?" Margaret asked. Harold looked at the farmhouse where David was living comfortably with heat and electricity and good food. Harold thought about all the times he and Margaret had been cold and hungry, while David spent their money on trucks and house repairs. "I'm going to get our money back," Harold said. "And I'm going to make sure all 3 of our children pay for what they've done to us." But first, Harold needed help. He needed someone who understood the law and could fight for him and Margaret. He needed a lawyer who would not be afraid to go after his own children. Harold had never sued anyone in his life, but his children had forced him into a corner. If they wanted to play legal games with papers and bank accounts, Harold would learn how to play those games too. The war for Harold and Margaret's future was about to begin. Harold spent 3 days thinking about how to confront his children. He wanted to be smart about this. He needed to hear what they had to say before he decided what to do next. Harold asked Mrs. Peterson to drive him to town one more time. He went to the library and made copies of all the mining company documents. He also made copies of the bank statements that Mrs. Collins had given him. Harold wanted to have proof of everything before he talked to his children. On Saturday morning, Harold called Michael and told him to come to the farm. He said it was important family business that could not wait. Harold also called Sarah and David. He told all 3 children to meet at the farmhouse at 2 o'clock. "What's this about, Dad?" Michael asked over the phone. "You'll find out when you get here," Harold said. At exactly 2 o'clock, all 3 children were sitting in the farmhouse living room. Harold and Margaret came in from the barn. Harold was carrying a folder full of papers. David looked nervous. He kept looking at the folder in Harold's hands. Michael and Sarah seemed annoyed, like they had better things to do with their Saturday afternoon. "What's this all about, Dad?" Sarah asked. "I had to cancel plans with my family to drive all the way out here." Harold sat down in his old recliner, the same chair he had sat in for 20 years before his children moved him to the barn. Margaret sat on the couch next to him. "I want to talk to you about the Thompson Family Trust," Harold said. David's face went white. Michael and Sarah looked confused. "The what?" Michael asked. Harold opened his folder and pulled out the bank statements. "The Thompson Family Trust, the bank account that contains over $1 million of mining royalty money that belongs to me and your mother." The room was completely quiet. David was staring at the floor. Michael and Sarah were looking back and forth between Harold and David. "I don't know what you're talking about, Dad," Sarah said. Harold pulled out the mining company contract and the payment records. 5 years ago, Midwest Mining Corporation started sending us quarterly payments of $47,000. Those payments were supposed to come to me and your mother. Instead, they went into a bank account controlled by David. Harold spread the bank statements out on the coffee table. "David has been stealing our money for 5 years. He spent almost $400,000 on trucks and house repairs and paying off his debts." Michael picked up one of the bank statements and looked at it. His face was getting red. "David, is this true?" David finally looked up. "It's not what it looks like." "Then explain what it is," Harold said. David stood up and started pacing around the room. "When Dad signed those papers in the hospital, he gave me power of attorney over the farm operations. That included managing all income from the farm." "The mining money is not farm income," Harold said. "Those mineral rights belong to my father and they belong to me now. You had no right to that money." "I was managing it for you," David shouted. "I was protecting you from making bad financial decisions." Margaret spoke for the first time. "Protecting us? You moved us into a barn and let us go hungry while you spent our money." Sarah was reading through the bank statements. "David, you bought a $50,000 truck with their money. I needed a truck for the farm operations." "What about this $35,000 payment to Peterson Construction?" Michael asked. David did not answer right away. Finally, he said, "I was fixing up my house." "Your house," Harold said. "What does your house have to do with farm operations?" "I needed a nice place to live so I could manage the farm properly." Harold could not believe what he was hearing. David was actually trying to justify stealing their money. "What about these checks you wrote to Michael and Sarah?" Harold asked. "Did they know where this money was coming from?" Michael and Sarah both started talking at the same time. "I didn't know anything about mining money," Sarah said. "David told me you wanted to help with my business expenses," Michael said. Harold looked at his oldest son. "So you took money from David without asking where it came from?" Michael's face was red. "David said you and Mom wanted to invest in my construction company. He said you wanted to help me expand." "And you believed that?" Margaret asked. "You believed that we wanted to give you $25,000 while we were living in a barn?" Sarah was looking through more of the bank statements. "David, you gave me $15,000 last year for Jenny's college tuition. You said it was a gift from Mom and Dad." "It was a gift," David said. "I was giving them what Mom and Dad would have wanted to give you." Harold stood up. He was angrier than he had ever been in his life. "You stole our money, and then you decided how to spend it without asking us. You gave away our money while we were cold and hungry and could not even get to a doctor." "I was taking care of the family," David yelled. "I was making sure everyone had what they needed." "Everyone except us," Margaret said quietly. The room was quiet again. Michael and Sarah were both staring at David like they had never seen him before. "David, how could you do this to them?" Sarah asked. "I did it for all of us. I kept the farm running." I made sure everyone in the family had money when they needed it. I was being responsible." Harold picked up the bank statements and put them back in his folder. "David, you were being a thief. You stole over $1 million from your parents." "It's not stealing when it's family money. It's not family money," Harold shouted. "It's my money and your mother's money. We earned it by owning this land for 40 years. Michael was looking sick. "Dad, I had no idea. David told me you wanted to help with my business. If I had known he was stealing your money—" "What would you have done, Michael?" Harold asked. "Would you have given it back? Would you have come to check on us in the barn?" Michael did not have an answer for that. Sarah was crying. "Mom, Dad, I'm so sorry. I thought David was taking good care of you. I thought you were happy living in the barn temporarily." "Happy?" Margaret said. "Sarah, we've been cold and hungry for months. We've been living like homeless people on our own land. But David said you were doing fine. He said you liked the privacy." Harold looked at his youngest child. "David, tell your brother and sister the truth. Tell them how you've been treating us." David was cornered, and he knew it. His face was angry and desperate. "I've been doing the best I could. Do you have any idea how much work it is to run this farm? Do you know how much responsibility I've had? We ran this farm for 40 years without stealing anyone's money," Harold said. "That was different. Things are more complicated now." Harold had heard enough. He stood up and faced all three of his children. "Here's what's going to happen. David, you are going to return every penny you stole from us. Michael and Sarah, you are going to return the money David gave you. And all three of you are going to move out of our lives. Dad, you can't." "Be serious," Michael said. "I am completely serious. You have all shown us who you really are. You are people who will steal from your own parents and then lie about it." Sarah was crying harder now. "Dad, I didn't know. I would never have taken the money if I had known." "But you did take it, Sarah. And you never once came to check on us properly. You never asked why we were living in a barn while David was buying trucks and fixing houses." Harold walked toward the door. Margaret followed him. "Where are you going?" David asked. "We're going to see a lawyer," Harold said. "We're going to get our money back, and we're going to make sure you can never do this to us again." Harold and Margaret walked out of the farmhouse and back to their barn room. Behind them, they could hear their children arguing with each other. They could hear David yelling and Sarah crying and Michael demanding answers. Harold did not care about their arguments anymore. His children had made their choices. Now Harold and Margaret would make theirs. The war was just beginning. Harold woke up early on Monday morning with a clear plan. He and Margaret were going to fight back, and they were going to win. Harold had spent his whole life being fair and honest, but his children had taught him that sometimes you have to fight for what is right. Mrs. Peterson had offered to help Harold and Margaret in any way she could. When Harold called her and asked for another ride to town, she came right away. "Harold, you and Margaret look like you haven't been eating enough," Mrs. Peterson said as they drove to town. "Why don't you come to my house for dinner tonight? I'm making pot roast." Harold was touched by her kindness. It reminded him that there were still good people in the world, even if his own children were not among them. "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Peterson. We would like that very much." Mrs. Peterson drove them to the office of Robert Martinez, a lawyer who specialized in elder abuse cases. Harold had found his name in the phone book and had called him that morning. Mr. Martinez had agreed to see them right away. Mr. Martinez was a young man, maybe 40 years old, with kind eyes and a serious expression. His office was small but neat, with law books lining the walls. "Mr. and Mrs. Thompson, please tell me what happened," Mr. Martinez said. Harold spread out all the documents on the lawyer's desk: the mining contract, the bank statements, the payment records from Midwest Mining Corporation. He told Mr. Martinez the whole story, from Harold's heart attack to discovering the hidden money to confronting the children. Mr. Martinez listened carefully, taking notes. When Harold finished talking, the lawyer sat back in his chair and shook his head. "Mr. Thompson, this is one of the worst cases of elder financial abuse I've ever seen. Your children have stolen over $1 million from you." "Can we get our money back?" Margaret asked. "I believe we can, Mrs. Thompson, but first we need to take some immediate steps to protect you. Mr. Martinez explained that Harold and Margaret needed to revoke all the power of attorney documents they had signed. They needed to take back control of their own finances and property. The papers you signed in the hospital gave David too much power, Mr. Martinez said. We need to cancel those papers immediately. Mr. Martinez helped Harold and Margaret fill out new legal documents. These papers said that David no longer had any authority to make decisions about the farm or about Harold and Margaret's money. We also need to open new bank accounts in your names only, Mr. Martinez said. I want to make sure your children cannot access any more of your money. They walked to First National Bank, where Mrs. Collins helped Harold and Margaret open new checking and savings accounts. Harold also called Midwest Mining Corporation and told them to send all future payments to his new account. Mr. Thompson, I'm so glad you called, Janet from the mining company said. We were getting worried about you. We sent several letters to your address, but no one ever responded. Harold realized that David had been intercepting their mail along with everything else. David had probably been throwing away letters from the mining company to keep Harold and Margaret from finding out about the payments. Janet, from now on, please send all letters and payments directly to me at this new address, Harold said. He gave her the address of a post office box that Mr. Martinez had helped them set up. By the end of the day, Harold and Margaret had taken back control of their finances. They had new bank accounts, a new mailing address, and legal documents that prevented their children from making any more decisions for them. But Mr. Martinez warned them that the fight was just beginning. Your children are not going to give back this money without a legal battle, he said. We need to file both civil and criminal charges against them. What's the difference? Harold asked. The civil case is about getting your money back. The criminal case is about punishing them for what they did to you. Mr. Martinez filed a civil lawsuit against all 3 children, demanding that they return every penny they had taken. He also contacted the district attorney's office about filing criminal charges for elder financial abuse. In Kansas, financial exploitation of vulnerable adults is a serious crime, Mr. Martinez explained. David could go to prison for what he did. Harold was not sure he wanted to send his own son to prison, but Mr. Martinez said it was important to send a message. If we don't pursue criminal charges, other people might think they can get away with stealing from elderly parents, Mr. Martinez said. When Harold and Margaret returned to the farm that evening, David was waiting for them in the barn. He looked angry and desperate. Dad, what did you do today? We took back control of our lives, Harold said. You can't do this to me. I've been taking care of this farm for months. You've been stealing from us for months, Margaret said. David's face was red with anger. If you keep fighting me on this, I'll make sure you never get a penny of that. Money! Harold looked at his youngest son. David, you don't have any power over our money anymore. We changed the bank accounts. We revoked your power of attorney. You can't touch our money ever again. You'll regret this, David shouted. You have no idea how to manage that much money. You'll lose it all. We'll take that risk, Harold said. David stormed out of the barn. Harold and Margaret could hear him slamming doors in the farmhouse. That night, Harold and Margaret had dinner at Mrs. Peterson's house. It was the first real meal they had eaten in months. Mrs. Peterson had made pot roast, with potatoes and carrots and fresh bread. Harold and Margaret ate until they were completely full. You two are skin and bones, Mrs. Peterson said. How long has it been since you had a good meal? Harold was embarrassed to admit how badly his children had been treating them. But Mrs. Peterson was kind and understanding. You know, Harold, my spare bedroom is empty if you and Margaret need a place to stay while you sort out this legal mess. Harold was grateful for the offer, but he had a different plan. Thank you, Mrs. Peterson, but we're going to stay on our farm. It's our land, and our children have no right to force us out of our own house. The next morning, Harold and Margaret moved out of the barn and back into the farmhouse. David had left during the night, taking most of his belongings with him. Harold did not know where David had gone, and he did not care. Harold and Margaret walked through their own house for the first time in months. It felt strange to be back in rooms they had lived in for 40 years. David had changed some things and had left the house messy, but it was still their home. It feels good to be back, Margaret said as she stood in her own kitchen. Harold agreed. They were back where they belonged, and they had their money and their dignity back. But the legal fight was far from over. A week later, Mr. Martinez called with an update on the case. "I have good news and bad news," he said. "The good news is that the district attorney is filing criminal charges against David for elder financial abuse. The bad news is that your other two children are fighting the civil lawsuit. They claim they had no idea the money was stolen." Harold was not surprised. Michael and Sarah had always been good at making excuses when they got caught doing something wrong. "What happens next?" Harold asked. "We go to court," Mr. Martinez said. "And we fight for every penny they took from you." Harold hung up the phone and looked at Margaret. They had been through so much together over 55 years of marriage. They had survived the Great Depression, World War II, droughts, floods, and economic hardships. They had raised 3 children and built a successful farm. Now they were fighting their own children in court. It was not how Harold had imagined. Spending his golden years, but he was determined to win. Harold and Margaret had learned that they were stronger than they thought. They had learned that they could survive on their own and fight for themselves when they had to. Most importantly, they had learned that justice was possible, even when the people who hurt you are your own family. The legal battle took 18 long months. During that time, Harold and Margaret learned more about the law than they had ever wanted to know. They spent many days in courtrooms and lawyers' offices, telling their story over and over again. Mr. Martinez was a good lawyer who fought hard for them. He gathered evidence, interviewed witnesses, and built a strong case against Harold and Margaret's children. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, canceled checks, and testimony from Mrs. Collins at the bank all proved that David had been stealing the mining royalty money. Michael and Sarah hired their own lawyers and tried to claim they were innocent victims. Their lawyers argued that Michael and Sarah had no way of knowing that the money David gave them was stolen. But Mr. Martinez was ready for this argument. He showed the court that Michael had received $25,000 from David at the same time that Harold and Margaret were living in a barn. He showed that Sarah had accepted $15,000 for her daughter's college tuition without ever asking where the money came from. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Mr. Martinez said during his closing argument, "Michael and Sarah Thompson may not have known exactly where this money came from, but they certainly knew their parents were living in poverty. They knew Harold and Margaret had been moved to a barn. They knew their parents could not afford medical care or proper food, yet they took thousands of dollars from David without asking a single question." The jury agreed with Mr. Martinez. After 3 days of deliberation, they found all 3 children guilty of financial exploitation. The court ordered them to pay back $800,000 plus legal fees and interest. David's criminal trial was separate from the civil case. The district attorney's office prosecuted him for elder abuse, fraud, and theft. David's criminal lawyer tried to argue that David had been trying to help his parents by managing their money, but the prosecutor had a strong case. She showed the jury pictures of the cold barn room where Harold and Margaret had been forced to live. She brought in Mrs. Peterson as a witness to testify about how thin and weak Harold and Margaret had become. The prosecutor also showed the jury David's bank records proving that he had spent the stolen money on trucks, house improvements, and personal expenses while his parents lived without heat, proper food, or medical care. David was found guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced him to 3 years in prison and ordered him to pay full restitution to his parents. Michael and Sarah were not charged with crimes, but they had to pay back all the money they had received from David. Michael's construction business suffered because he had to pay back $25,000. Sarah had to take out a loan to repay the $15,000 she had used for her daughter's college tuition. Harold felt sad about his children going through these difficulties, but he also felt that justice had been served. His children had made choices, and now they had to live with the consequences. The most important result of the legal victory was that Harold and Margaret got their money back. The court ordered the children to repay $800,000, which was most of what they had stolen. The mining company also continued to send quarterly payments of $47,000 directly to Harold and Margaret's new bank account. With their money restored, Harold and Margaret were able to live comfortably for the first time in months. They hired contractors to renovate the farmhouse and make it more suitable for their age. They installed new heating and air conditioning, updated the kitchen and bathrooms, and put in ramps and railings to make the house safer. Harold and Margaret also hired Maria Santos, a kind woman who came to work as their live-in caregiver. Maria cooked healthy meals, helped with housework, and drove Harold and Margaret to doctor appointments. Having Maria there gave Harold and Margaret security and companionship. One of the most important things Harold and Margaret did was establish a trust to protect their money. Mr. Martinez helped them set up legal documents that would prevent anyone from taking advantage of them again. The trust ensured that Harold and Margaret would always have enough money for their care, and it protected their assets from being stolen. Harold and Margaret also decided to use some of their money to help other elderly people who might be facing similar problems. They donated $100,000 to the Kansas Elder Protection Agency, an organization that helps elderly victims of family abuse. "We want to make sure other people don't have to go through what we went through," Margaret told the newspaper reporter who wrote about their case. Their story became well known throughout the county. Harold and Margaret received letters from other elderly people who were having problems with their own families. Some of these people asked for advice, and Harold always encouraged them to seek legal help if they were being mistreated. "Don't be afraid to fight for yourself," Harold would tell them. "Just because someone is family doesn't give them the right to steal from you or hurt you." Harold and Margaret's relationship with their children never recovered. David went to prison and did not contact his parents after his release. Michael and Sarah each tried to apologize and rebuild their relationships with Harold and Margaret, but too much damage had been done. "I'm sorry, but I can't trust you anymore," Margaret told Sarah during a phone call. "You chose money over your parents. I can't forget that." Michael wrote several letters asking for forgiveness, but Harold did not respond. Harold had learned that some wounds are too deep to heal, even between parents and children. Instead of focusing on their lost relationships with their children, Harold and Margaret built new friendships with people who truly cared about them. Mrs. Peterson became like a sister to Margaret. Maria became like a daughter to both of them. They made friends with other elderly couples in the community and became active in church and community organizations. Harold's health improved once he was living in a warm house with good food and proper medical care. His heart condition stabilized, and he was able to enjoy light farm work again. Margaret's cough disappeared, and she gained back the weight she had lost during their months in the barn. As Harold approached his 80th birthday, he reflected on everything that had happened. The betrayal by his children had been the most painful experience of his life, but it had also taught him important lessons. Harold learned that he and Margaret were stronger and more resilient than they had ever imagined. They learned that they could survive terrible hardships and fight back against injustice. They learned that family is not just about blood relationships, but about the people who truly care for you and support you. Most importantly, Harold and Margaret learned that it is never too late to stand up for yourself and demand justice. Even elderly people living in barns can fight back and win when they have courage and determination. Harold and Margaret spent their remaining years in comfort and dignity. They traveled to places they had always wanted to see. They enjoyed their renovated farmhouse and their beautiful garden. They took satisfaction in knowing that their story had helped other elderly people protect themselves from family predators. When Harold died peacefully at age 85, Margaret was holding his hand in their own bedroom in their own house. When Margaret died 2 years later at age 84, she was surrounded by Maria and Mrs. Peterson and other friends who had become her chosen family. Harold and Margaret's legacy was not just the farm they had built or the money they had recovered. Their legacy was the proof that elderly people do not have to accept abuse from anyone, not even their own children. Their legacy was the courage to fight for justice, no matter how old you are or how hopeless things seem. Their story became a cautionary tale that spread throughout rural Kansas and beyond. It reminded families that elderly parents deserve respect and protection, not exploitation and abandonment. It showed that justice is possible, even when the people who hurt you are the ones who are supposed to love you most.